Around the middle of the 15th century, knights right the way across Europe, many of them switched from this type of helmet to this type of helmet here. And we're not going to be looking in this video at exactly why they switched from the great bassinet to the sallet right the way across Europe, but instead we're going to be looking at one particular point related to vision. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, many of you will know that I like to do things in armour, and I love armour, and one of the common types of helmets that you will see in 15th century historical artwork, or indeed in modern reenactment, is the sallet. Now, before anyone says the bottom of your face is exposed, well, these are usually worn with a bever, okay, which protects the bottom half of the face. So they have two separate pieces, one essentially that protects the top half of the face up here, and a second piece which protects the bottom half of the face. So this makes them very versatile helmets, because obviously you can take the bever off, and then you've just got a helmet that protects the top of your head. You can put the visor up, or if it's got a fixed, not all of them have a raising visor here, you can tilt it back on your head and look underneath like that. And in fact, if we look in, German and Swiss artwork, for example, often we find they don't have a separate visor, but they're just going to tilt them back on the head. And you walk around like this, and then if people start shooting things at you, then you can tilt it down and you're straight into using it as a normal sallet. So in the 15th century, it was very common for knights and also common soldiers as well to start adopting these sallets, but knights and men-at-arms, we should more correctly call them, very often switched from these big, cumbersome, great bassinets, which offer huge amounts of protection, to this sallet. And they're obviously very different types of helmet. Now, this is a really big topic, potentially, and we're not going to look at why exactly they switched from these to these in countries like England and Spain and France and Italy, but we are going to look at one particular detail of vision. Now, the first thing to say, of course, is both of these helmets can be worn with an open face, and in fact certain types of sallet didn't even have a visor on them or any facial protection at all. They were just open-faced, and I often wear an open-faced sallet myself in a reenactment context, although I wouldn't want to do that if people were shooting arrows at me, but open-faced, it really doesn't make any difference. And even if you've got a massive great bassinet or an earlier Helmskull, if the visor is raised at this point, there isn't any difference in the vision whatsoever. You can see everything that you could normally see in usual life. But when the visors are down, it becomes a very different story. Now, on a fundamental level, when you look at these two helmets next to each other, you will notice that this one has vision slits around here, and it also has a lot of what are commonly called breaths, but they're more than that. I'll come back to that in a second, down here. So this has more perforations in the visor than this does. Now, obviously, I'll just put the great bassinet down for a second. Obviously, normally with a sallet, you'd be wearing a bever down here, which doesn't really interact with your vision very much. It depends how high up it comes, actually. It can do, depending on the bever, but usually they finish around nose height. But you'll notice that most sallets, not all, later in at the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century, we do get sallets with perforations here, but most of them are a solid plate across here and either one or sometimes divided slit here. So theoretically, you would look at this and you think, well, this has only got one slit, whereas the great bassinet must be absolutely awesome to see through because you've got so many holes. Now, on a basic level, that can be true. However, here's an interesting thing, and this is the main point of the video. There is a lot to be said here about the proximity to the face, to the eyes. Okay, now you don't need a helmet to try this for yourself. So take your fingers and make a little slit like this, and if you put it close to your eyes and look through, you can see most of what you would normally be able to see, okay, through that slit. But the further it gets away from your eyes like this, the narrower and narrower and narrower your field of vision gets. Now, an interesting detail of sallets is they sit quite close to the face, very close to the face in fact. And if I just pull this visor down here, you'll notice that usually the brow ridge up here is really only just, maybe a centimetre and a half away from my forehead. That means that the top level of this slit, even though the bottom usually projects a little bit further forward of that, the slit itself is very close to my eyes. So despite the fact that I only have one slit, as I say, sometimes it's two slits, but I only have one vision slit, it is close to my eyes, and therefore my vision, although I do have a blind spot down here, so for example, I can see everything up to about that level and down to there and out to, well, almost probably about 100 degrees out there, I do have a bit of a blind spot here. Now, what's interesting is when you get used to fighting in helmets, most helmets have a bit of a blind spot around here, and you need that for protection. We'll come back to that topic in a second. But you do get used to just moving your head up and down to see different heights. So whereas normally with an open face, you just move your eyes up and down, with a helmet on, usually you have to move the head up and down, or if you can't, if it's connected to your breastplate, like with many great bassinets, for example, you tilt your body slightly. But nevertheless, you look up and down in order to see things at different heights, because you do have a blind spot here. Now, with the great bassinet, what's interesting is you might think, well, this doesn't have that blind spot because it's got all of these holes. But actually, you have this hard barrier just underneath here, which is very important. Again, I'll come back to protection in a second, which does create the same effect. So you do have a blind spot just under the main vision slits here. You can see through those holes, but nevertheless, with both of these helmets, you end up tilting up and down to see different height things. But the important point is that this is much further away from the face. If you look at the projection of the visor of the sallet, this sallet is not that far away from the end of my nose, whereas the great bassinet is miles away from the end of your nose. So because the visor and the vision slits are further away, it's got that narrowing effect. So the fact that this is full of holes and this isn't full of holes are connected by, partially, by the proximity to the face. The fact that this is closer to my face means I don't need those extra holes to see through, whereas with a visor like this, or a houndskull bassinet, an earlier version of the bassinet, you know, with the pointy nose, because they're much further away from the face, you need to have more holes in it to see through it, because the vision slit is further away from your eyes. Now, let's connect these two things together and talk about protection. So one of the things that we find is if you're doing something like poleaxe fighting, or even any type of harness fectum really, so fighting in armour, generally speaking, the great bassinet is just about one of the most protective helmets you can get, because it protects the neck, it's rigid at the back, it's big and heavy so it can absorb blows, and importantly, the visor is far away from the face. So if, for example, you are likely to get hit in the face with one of these, doesn't even need to be a full swing, but just any type of forceful blow with the steel poleaxe in the face is freaking horrible. But I can tell you, with a helmet like this, it's a lot more horrible than it is with a helmet like that. And the main reason, apart from the mass and the just general robustness of a great bassinet, is it's further away from your face. With a sallet, I have a potential opening here which can get knocked open between the bever and the sallet, and it's much, much closer to being smashed into my face than a great bassinet or a houndskull bassinet is. So fundamentally, for fighting on foot against heavy weapons, powerful weapons, the bassinet is my helmet of choice. And you could say, well, what about the close helmet or the armet? Well, again, they're quite close to the head, so usually they only have one vision slit. Okay, in the 16th century, some of them have more, but they have one primary vision slit, and that's quite close to your face. So they're almost like halfway between the great bassinet and the sallet. But fundamentally, you don't need all of the holes that you've got in this as you do with that to see. And an interesting byproduct. Now imagine, so we've talked about poleaxes, imagine you're having arrows shot at you. Well, here's an interesting thing. So just from the impact alone, this helmet is going to deal with those impacts great, but you've probably seen the arrows versus armour experiments, which my friend Todd has done. These holes can be a problem if people are shooting lots of arrows or crossbow bolts at you. because potentially they can find an opening. I mean, they could potentially go straight through a vision slit like that, but even these smaller holes, which they couldn't directly go through, but they could potentially force their way in through if they happen to land on one of those holes. Now, interestingly, while the sallet is less protective against heavy impacts from something like a lance or a poleaxe, it's actually got fewer openings, because if you've got the bever coming up inside here, this doesn't have any holes in it. You have only got a vision slit, which frankly, if you're walking into arrows, is quite easy to cover with your gauntlet, which is actually something we see in historical artwork, or even just tilting it downwards so that they hit there and they don't hit straight into the vision slit here. So the sallet is both less protective in one way and more protective in another way, but interestingly, despite only having one vision slit, can sometimes have better vision than certain types of bassinet. Finally, there are versions of the great bassinet which literally just have a grill on the front, and they're used for tournament purposes, and they are absolutely optimized for vision and breathing. So if you're going to be fighting tournament with perhaps certain types of poleaxes or wooden clubs, something that we see in René d'Anjou's tournament book, then they're fantastic. But the problem is you can't use them in war, because as soon as anyone shoots an arrow towards you, it's just going to go straight through the grill and into your face. Not to say we don't occasionally see them in artwork of war, we do, but usually you need a more enclosed face here. So there we go, two different philosophies, and maybe in the future I'll talk about how this applies to close helmets and armets, because it also applies to them. But fundamentally, you can either have a solid plate with one vision slit that's close to your face, or you can have a more protective, in theory, visor that's further away from your face and better for receiving heavy impacts, but it has to have more holes in it so that you can see what you're doing. I hope that's been illuminating. I have been Matt Easton, and I'll of course continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.